Snow blanketed the small town of Pine Hollow in a pristine layer of white, muffling the usual sounds of life. The Christmas lights lining the streets twinkled softly against the darkness, their glow reflected in frosted windows. It was a picturesque setting, the kind you'd see on a holiday postcard. But for Emma, the cheer of the season only deepened her unease. She had driven to Pine Hollow reluctantly, forced by a sense of obligation to visit her estranged grandparents. They had invited her every year since her parents had passed, but she'd always declined. This year, however, something felt different. The invitation had come with a note, hastily scrawled, "Please, come this time. It's important." Her grandparents' old farmhouse sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. It was the kind of place that looked idyllic during the day, but sinister at night. By the time Emma arrived, the sun had set, and the shadows of the trees stretched like skeletal fingers across the snow. She shivered as she stepped out of her car, her breath visible in the icy air. The house was eerily quiet. No lights shone from the windows, and the door creaked ominously as she pushed it open. "Grandma? Grandpa?" she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The living room was decorated with outdated Christmas ornaments, a small artificial tree standing crookedly in the corner. On the coffee table lay a single wrapped gift, its paper worn and faded. Emma frowned, her anxiety mounting. She ventured further into the house, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The kitchen was empty, save for a plate of untouched cookies and a glass of milk on the counter. They looked fresh, too fresh. A sudden thud from upstairs made her jump. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, before slowly climbing the creaking staircase. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. The noise had come from the farthest one. "Grandma? Grandpa?" she called again, her voice trembling. No response. She approached the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the knob. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a bedroom shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the moonlight filtering through the window, casting pale beams across the room. The bed was empty, its sheets rumpled as if someone had left in a hurry. But it was the closet door that drew her attention. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness within darkness. Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force, compelled her forward. She inched closer, her heart pounding in her chest. With a deep breath, she yanked the closet door open. It was empty. She exhaled in relief, though her hands still trembled. But as she turned to leave the room, she saw it. In the mirror above the dresser, a figure stood behind her. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned, but the room was empty. The figure was only in the mirror, its hollow eyes locked on hers. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed to the bed. Emma's legs felt like lead as she moved toward it, compelled by an unseen force. Beneath the bed, she saw the corner of something poking out, a piece of fabric, faded red and green. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she pulled it out. It was another wrapped gift, identical to the one downstairs, but this one had her name on it. A cold dread settled over her as she unwrapped the box. Inside was a small, old-fashioned doll, its porcelain face cracked and its glassy eyes staring blankly. A note lay beneath it. "Welcome home, Emma." The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. The mirror began to fog, and in its surface words appeared, scrawled as if by an invisible hand. "You can't leave now." The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. Emma bolted from the room, her fear overriding her paralysis. She raced down the stairs, her mind screaming for her to escape. But the front door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, it remained firmly shut. The windows were the same, the glass unyielding as she pounded on it. Behind her, the footsteps grew louder, closer. She turned to see the figure descending the stairs, its form more solid now, its hollow eyes burning with malevolence. Emma grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and swung it wildly. But when it connected, the figure dissolved into shadows, only to reappear closer, its skeletal hand reaching for her. She fled into the kitchen, her breath ragged, and grabbed a knife. The air was frigid now, her breath forming clouds as she backed into a corner. The figure loomed before her, its presence suffocating. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. It didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the table where the untouched plate of cookies sat. Slowly, Emma approached, her body moving against her will. She picked up the plate, the knife clattering to the floor. As she lifted the glass of milk to her lips, the figure vanished. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving her alone in the silent house. But Emma knew it wasn't over. She could feel it, watching, waiting. And when she looked down at the cookies, she saw her own reflection staring back at her from the glossy surface of the chocolate chips. She was trapped, a prisoner in the house where Christmas cheer had turned into eternal torment.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm rolled in faster than anyone in the town of Cedar Ridge had expected. Thick flakes whipped across the streets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. By nightfall, the entire area was locked under an icy grip, with only the howling wind breaking the silence. Rachel gripped the steering wheel of her SUV, squinting through the windshield as her wipers struggled against the accumulating snow. She had been on her way to visit her family for Christmas, but the storm had derailed her plans. A flashing sign on the highway had directed her to take an alternate route, and now she was lost, the twisting back roads leading her deeper into the wilderness. The fuel gauge dipped into the red zone. Panic gnawed at her as she scanned the endless rows of snow-covered trees for any sign of civilization. Just as she was about to give up hope, a faint glow appeared in the distance. She drove toward it, her tires slipping on the icy road until the source of the light came into view, an old lodge, its windows illuminated by warm, golden light. A wooden sign hung above the door, barely legible through the snow. Evergreen Pines Inn. Rachel hesitated. The building looked like it had been plucked out of another century, its weathered exterior and flickering lanterns giving it an unsettling charm. But with the storm raging and her gas tank nearly empty, she had little choice. Inside, the inn was eerily quiet. A fire crackled in the stone hearth and the scent of pine filled the air. The front desk was empty, but a small bell sat on the counter. Rachel rang it, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Moments later, a man emerged from a door behind the desk. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt but not unfriendly. His dark eyes seemed to pierce through her. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth but cold. "Looking for a room?" "Yes," Rachel said quickly, her unease growing. "Just for the night, the storm." "Say no more," the man interrupted. "We rarely get guests, but tonight seems special." He slid a key across the counter. "Room 7, upstairs at the end of the hall." Rachel thanked him, took the key, and made her way up the creaking staircase. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the shadows from the flickering wall sconces dancing ominously. Room 7 was just as the man had said, at the very end, its door slightly ajar. The room was simple, with an antique 4-poster bed and a single window overlooking the snowy landscape. Rachel locked the door behind her, grateful for the shelter, but a chill lingered in the air despite the radiator hissing softly in the corner. As she unpacked a few belongings, she noticed a peculiar object on the bedside table, an old snow globe. Inside was a perfect miniature replica of the lodge, down to the tiniest detail. She picked it up, shaking it gently, and watched as the snow swirled inside. A loud knock on her door startled her. She froze, her heart pounding. "Who is it?" she called. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Rachel hesitated before inching toward the door and peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. She unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peering out. The hall stretched before her, silent and still. But something was off. The flickering sconces cast shadows that seemed to twist and move unnaturally. Closing the door quickly, she turned back to the snow globe. Her breath hitched in her throat. The lodge inside had changed. Tiny figures now stood in the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. A sudden whisper filled the room, low and unintelligible. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rachel spun around, searching for the source, but she was alone. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered, and the radiator went silent. The room plunged into an unnatural cold, the kind that sank into her bones. The window frosted over, obscuring the outside world. Rachel grabbed her phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was dead. She turned back to the snow globe, now glowing faintly. The figures in the windows were gone, replaced by a single, dark figure standing in the doorway of the tiny lodge. A creak behind her made her blood run cold. She turned slowly, her eyes widening in terror. The door to her room was open, and in the dim hallway light stood a shadowy figure, its shape human but wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It stepped into the room, its hollow eyes locked on hers. Rachel stumbled back, clutching the snow globe. The figure advanced slowly, its movements jerky like a marionette on tangled strings. She threw the snow globe at it, the glass shattering on impact. For a brief moment, the figure froze, its form flickering like a dying flame. But then it smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that split its face. The whispers returned, deafening now, as the figure reached for her. Rachel screamed, the sound swallowed by the storm outside. By morning, the lodge was dark again, its windows empty. The storm had passed, and the roads were clear, but no one would see Rachel's car parked outside. Inside the lodge, a new snow globe sat on the front desk, its tiny lodge now featuring a single figure standing at the window, screaming silently into the eternal snowstorm.
Story number 3.
The Frost Hollow neighborhood was quiet, blanketed in freshly fallen snow that glittered under the dim glow of streetlights. Families were huddled indoors, celebrating Christmas Eve with laughter, food, and the warm hum of traditions. Except for Melanie. Melanie was house-sitting for the Grayson family while they were away visiting relatives. Their house was large, sitting at the edge of the woods that stretched for miles. She had agreed to the job mostly for the money and maybe a little for the solitude. Christmas wasn't her favorite time of year. It was easier to avoid it altogether. The house creaked as the wind howled outside, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Melanie wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch, her only company the faint hum of the television. She glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., almost midnight. She was about to turn off the TV and call it a night when she heard it. A faint knock at the back door. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, straining her ears. The knock came again, louder this time. Melanie stood slowly, clutching her phone as she moved toward the kitchen. The back door had a large glass window, and as she approached, she could see a figure standing outside. It was a man, his face obscured by the hood of a heavy coat. Snow clung to his shoulders, and he stood unnaturally still. Melanie's breath fogged the glass as she peered out. "Can I help you?" she called through the door, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised a gloved hand and knocked again, the sound sharper this time. "I'm sorry, I can't let you in," Melanie said, stepping back. "Maybe you should try the neighbors." The man didn't move. Unease clawed at her. She reached for her phone, ready to call the police, but when she looked back at the door, the man was gone. The backyard stretched into the forest, the fresh snow unbroken by footprints. Melanie's stomach churned. He couldn't have disappeared that quickly. Locking the back door, she turned off the kitchen light and moved back to the living room, her nerves on edge. She checked the front door, ensuring it was locked as well, and then grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, clutching it tightly. Minutes passed. The house was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind against the walls. She told herself it was fine, that the man had probably left, but then she heard it again. This time, the knock came from upstairs. Melanie's grip tightened on the fire poker. The knock echoed again, faint but deliberate. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Summoning what little courage she had, Melanie climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps making her stomach twist. The knocking grew louder as she neared the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and cold air seeped through the crack. She pushed the door open slowly, the fire poker raised. The window was wide open, snow blowing in and scattering across the hardwood floor. The room was empty, but on the bed lay something that made her blood run cold. It was a single wrapped gift, the paper adorned with cheerful snowflakes. A tag dangled from the ribbon, and in neat, blocky handwriting it read, "For Melanie." She didn't touch it. She didn't move. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Behind her, the floor creaked. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Before she could press call, the phone went dead. The screen flickered, then turned off completely. And then the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the open window. Melanie backed into the corner of the room, gripping the fire poker like a lifeline. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. And then a voice came from the hallway, soft and sing-song. "Merry Christmas, Melanie." Her scream was lost in the howling wind. When the Graysons returned the next morning, they found the house eerily quiet. The back door was wide open, snow trailing into the kitchen. Upstairs, the guest room window was still open, frost lining the edges of the glass. On the bed sat the unopened gift, the tag still reading, "For Melanie," but Melanie was nowhere to be found.
Story number 4.
The small mountain town of Pine Haven was known for its postcard-perfect Christmas celebrations, snow-draped trees, twinkling lights, and festive carolers strolling the streets. Every year, visitors came from miles around to experience the magic. But this year, something felt wrong. Sarah was driving through Pine Haven late on Christmas Eve. She had planned to arrive earlier, but the snowy roads had slowed her down. Her destination was her aunt's remote cabin, nestled just outside town. The last time she'd been there, she was a child, and her memories of the place were fuzzy at best. The streets of Pine Haven were oddly deserted. For a town so famous for its festivities, there wasn't a single light in any of the windows. The Christmas decorations, though still hanging, were faded and torn, as though they'd been forgotten for years. Sarah felt uneasy as she passed a group of carolers standing perfectly still on a street corner. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces obscured by the falling snow. As she slowed her car to get a better look, the group turned their heads in unison to watch her. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their mouths too wide and teeth far too sharp. Heart-pounding, Sarah pressed the gas pedal and sped out of town. The eerie image of the carolers burned in her mind. The snow fell heavier, and her tires slipped on the icy road as she wound her way up the mountain. By the time she reached her aunt's cabin, the storm was in full force. The wind howled through the trees, and the forest seemed darker than she remembered. The cabin itself was just as she recalled, rustic, with a stone chimney and a wreath on the door. Sarah knocked, but there was no answer. She tried the door, and it swung open easily. Inside, the cabin was dark, the fireplace cold. There was no sign of her aunt. Sarah called out, but was met only with silence. She found a note on the kitchen table, written in her aunt's familiar handwriting. "Had to leave town unexpectedly. Make yourself at home. Don't go out after dark. Lock the doors." The last part of the note made Sarah's stomach churn. Why would her aunt leave such a strange warning? She locked the door as instructed and built a fire in the hearth, trying to shake off her unease. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but the storm outside seemed to be getting worse. The wind howled like a living thing, and strange sounds echoed through the forest, branches snapping, low growls, and something that almost sounded like laughter. Sarah sat on the couch, clutching a blanket, when she noticed something odd about the Christmas tree in the corner. The ornaments were all old and mismatched, but one in particular caught her eye, a small glass bauble with a moving figure inside. She picked it up, staring at the tiny scene inside. It was a perfect replica of the cabin, complete with a glowing fire and a figure seated on the couch. Her blood ran cold. The figure in the bauble was her. As she watched, the tiny version of herself stood and turned to look out the window. At that exact moment, a loud knock came from the cabin's front door. Sarah dropped the bauble, which didn't shatter but instead rolled under the couch. She stared at the door, heart hammering. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. The knock came again, harder this time. She crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow, but then she spotted it, a figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in tattered black cloth. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but two glowing red eyes pierced the darkness. Sarah stumbled back, grabbing her phone. No signal. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. The door rattled in its frame as though the figure was trying to force it open. She grabbed the fire poker and backed into the corner, her breath coming in short gasps. The knocking stopped, but the wind outside seemed to grow louder, carrying with it a chilling voice. "Let me in." The voice was deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. Sarah shook her head, clutching the fire poker tighter. The cabin lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. The only light came from the fire, which seemed to dim as the temperature in the room plummeted. The voice came again, this time from inside the cabin. "Why won't you let me in?" Sarah spun around, her eyes searching the shadows. The fire cast flickering shapes on the walls and she could swear one of them moved. A low growl rumbled from the fireplace, and she turned just in time to see the flames extinguish completely. In the darkness, she could hear it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. "Stay back," she screamed, swinging the fire poker wildly. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, and what she saw made her drop the poker in terror. The figure was inside the cabin now, towering over her. Its hood had fallen back, revealing a face that was barely human. Its skin pale and cracked, its mouth filled with jagged teeth that stretched into an unnatural grin. The lights flickered off again, and the cabin was filled with the sound of Sarah's screams. By morning, the storm had passed, and Pine Haven was as picturesque as ever. But when the Graysons returned to their cabin later that week, they found the door ajar and the house empty. On the couch sat a small glass bauble, its scene perfectly preserved. Inside was a tiny replica of the cabin, and a figure of Sarah, frozen in terror, staring out the window at something only she could see.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm had rolled in faster than anyone expected, turning the quiet countryside into a white abyss. Emma had planned to spend Christmas Eve at her parents' house, but the treacherous conditions forced her to take refuge in an old motel she'd stumbled upon at the edge of the woods. The sign outside flickered erratically, its faded letters spelling out Evergreen Lodge. It didn't look welcoming, but it was the only shelter for miles. Emma pulled into the empty lot and hurried inside, her breath visible in the freezing air. The lobby was dimly lit with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. Behind the counter sat an older man with a lined face and a fixed smile. "Just passing through?" he asked as she approached. "Yes," Emma replied, shivering. "The storm's too bad to keep driving. Do you have a room?" "Plenty of vacancies," he said, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 6, just down the hall. Heat's a little finicky, but it works." Emma thanked him, paid in cash, and made her way to her room. The hallway was eerily quiet, and the dim lighting cast long shadows that seemed to shift as she walked. Room 6 was small but clean, with a single bed and a nightstand. A decorative wreath hung crookedly on the door, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments dusty and dull. She locked the door behind her, threw her bag on the bed, and sank into the worn armchair by the window. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see the parking lot. The wind howled, rattling the window pane, and Emma tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone. But there was no signal, and the motel's Wi-Fi wasn't working. Frustrated, she tossed her phone aside and turned on the small TV. Static greeted her, followed by a distorted image that flickered in and out. A local news broadcast, though the sound was warped and garbled. Emma squinted at the screen, trying to make out the reporter's words. "Another disappearance? Local legend? Evergreen Lodge." The screen went black and Emma's stomach twisted. She turned off the TV and tried to convince herself it was just an old set malfunctioning. But as she sat in silence, she became acutely aware of how wrong everything felt. The storm outside seemed almost unnaturally loud, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, repetitive thudding. It was coming from the hallway. Emma froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, moving closer. Thud, thud, thud. It stopped just outside her door. Her breath hitched as the doorknob jiggled. She grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, clutching it like a weapon, and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The doorknob stopped moving, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Emma waited, every muscle in her body tense. Finally, she summoned the courage to approach the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. She stepped back, her heart still racing, and tried to shake off her fear. But then she noticed something she hadn't before. The wreath on the door. It was now on the floor. Emma backed away, her pulse pounding. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, coming from inside the room. She spun around, her eyes darting across the shadows. "Who's there?" The whisper grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Leave. Run. Before it comes back." Emma's blood turned cold as the room seemed to darken. The small Christmas tree began to shake, its ornaments clinking softly. And then the whispering stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly quiet. Then the bathroom door creaked open. Emma hadn't touched it. From the shadows of the bathroom, a figure emerged, tall and skeletal, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its mouth stretched into a grin that split its face. Emma screamed, dropping the lamp as she bolted for the door. The thing moved faster than she thought possible. its bony fingers grazing her shoulder as she flung the door open and ran into the hallway. The corridor was different now. The lights were flickering violently, and the walls seemed to close in on her. Doors slammed open and shut as she ran, distorted faces peering out at her with empty, soulless eyes. She reached the lobby, breathless and terrified, but it was empty. The man at the counter was gone, and the front door wouldn't budge no matter how hard she pulled. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the motel, and Emma turned to see the thing crawling toward her on all fours, its limbs bending at impossible angles. In a blind panic, she grabbed a chair and hurled it through the front window. The glass shattered, and she scrambled through the opening, ignoring the shards that tore at her hands and knees. She ran into the storm, the snow blinding her as she fled. Behind her, the motel loomed like a dark, malevolent thing, its windows glowing faintly as though it were alive. By the time she reached the main road, Emma was shaking and bleeding, but she didn't stop running until a passing car picked her up. When she tried to explain what had happened, the driver gave her a strange look. "Evergreen Lodge?" he said. "That place burned down years ago. Nobody's been there since." Emma turned to look back, but the storm had swallowed the road. The motel was gone, leaving only the chilling memory of its haunting whispers and the thing that had almost taken her.
Story number 6.
The wind carried an icy chill as Nathan pulled up to the edge of the forest. He had been warned not to take this road. Blackwood Trail is cursed, the locals said, but he was behind schedule and the shortcut would save him nearly 2 hours. The woods loomed ahead, dark and dense, with trees that stretched high into the sky, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. Snow began to fall softly, blanketing the dirt road as he drove deeper into the forest. At first, the journey was uneventful. The crunch of snow under his tires and the occasional rustle of leaves were the only sounds. But as he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated something lying in the middle of the road. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. Its body was twisted unnaturally, legs bent at odd angles. Blood stained the snow around it, and its eyes were wide open, staring blankly. Nathan slowed down, a sense of unease creeping over him. As he considered driving around it, the deer's head twitched. Then its legs began to move, jerking spasmodically as if trying to stand. But it wasn't right. The movements were too sudden, too sharp, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. Before he could react, the deer's head snapped in his direction, its wide, lifeless eyes locking onto his. Nathan slammed his foot on the gas, swerving around the creature and speeding down the road. His heart pounded as the forest closed in around him, the trees seeming to press closer with every passing mile. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the deer following him, but the road remained empty, shrouded in darkness. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in his chest began to ease. He convinced himself it was just an injured animal acting out of instinct. That's when he saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the road, barely visible in the shadows. At first, Nathan thought it was a person, tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like a tattered coat. But as his headlights illuminated it, he realized it wasn't human. The thing's skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes sunken and black as coal. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It didn't move as Nathan's car approached, but its head tilted slightly, as if watching him. Nathan's foot hovered over the brake, but his instincts screamed at him to keep going. He sped past the figure, refusing to look back. The forest seemed to grow darker, the snow falling heavier now. His tires skidded on the icy road as he rounded another curve, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. A loud thud shook the car, and Nathan nearly lost control. He pulled over, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Something had hit the back of his car. He hesitated before stepping out, the cold biting at his skin as he inspected the damage. The rear bumper was dented, and deep claw marks raked across the trunk. Nathan's pulse quickened. He spun around, scanning the darkness, but the forest was silent. Too silent. He climbed back into the car and locked the doors, determined to get out of the woods as quickly as possible. But when he turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," he muttered, trying again. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then came the sound, a soft scratching, like nails on glass. Nathan froze, his eyes darting to the windshield. A handprint was forming on the frost-covered glass, long fingers trailing down slowly. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the car now. A shadow moved outside, circling the vehicle. Nathan couldn't see it clearly, but he knew it was the thing he'd seen on the road. The car shook as something slammed against it, the windows rattling in their frames. "Leave me alone," Nathan shouted, his voice trembling. The assault stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, a low, guttural voice whispered from just outside the driver's side window. "You're not supposed to be here." Nathan turned slowly, his breath fogging up the glass. The thing's face was pressed against the window, its black eyes staring into his. He screamed, scrambling to the passenger side and throwing the door open. He ran into the forest, the cold air burning his lungs. Branches clawed at his face as he stumbled through the snow, the sound of footsteps crunching behind him. He didn't dare look back. The whispers followed him, growing louder, overlapping in a chorus of malevolent voices. "You can't escape. This is our home. You'll stay forever." Nathan tripped, falling face first into the snow. When he looked up, he was surrounded. Dozens of them, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They moved closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, like broken puppets. Nathan tried to scream, but the cold stole his voice. The last thing he saw was the wide, jagged grin of the thing from the road as it loomed over him, its teeth gleaming in the moonlight. By morning, the storm had passed, and the forest was quiet once more. Nathan's car was found abandoned on Blackwood Trail, its doors wide open and claw marks etched deep into the metal. No trace of him was ever found.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm descended without warning, thick flakes spiraling from the sky and covering the road in minutes. Casey gripped the wheel of her SUV tightly, her breath fogging up the glass, despite the heater running at full blast. She'd been warned to avoid the old highway through Pine Hollow, but the faster route was too tempting. The faint outline of a sign loomed ahead, barely visible through the blizzard. Casey squinted and caught the words, "Pine Hollow Inn, vacancy." She felt a pang of relief. The road had become nearly impassable, and the inn seemed her best chance to wait out the storm. The building appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the snow itself. Its windows glowed faintly, and a crooked wooden sign swung on rusty chains above the door. It didn't look welcoming, but the snow was falling harder, and her visibility was almost gone. Casey parked her car and trudged through the drifts to the entrance. The door creaked as she pushed it open, a faint bell jingling to announce her arrival. Inside, the inn was dimly lit, its decor frozen in time with faded wallpaper and dusty furniture. A man stood behind the front desk, his expression unreadable. "Welcome," he said, his voice flat. "We don't get many visitors this time of year." Casey forced a smile. "The storm caught me off guard. Do you have a room for the night?" He nodded slowly and slid an old-fashioned ledger across the counter. As Casey signed her name, she noticed the names of other guests. Most were dated decades ago. "Room 6, the man said, handing her a key with a tarnished brass tag. "Up the stairs and to your left." The hallway was lined with portraits, their subjects gazing down at her with unsettling intensity. The eyes in one painting seemed to follow her as she climbed the creaking staircase. Her room was small but clean, with a single bed and a window that overlooked the snow-covered forest. She locked the door and drew the curtains before settling in. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. Sleep eluded Casey, her mind replaying the eerie stillness of the inn. She was just starting to drift off when she heard it. A soft knock at the door. She froze, her heart pounding. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Who is it?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Casey stepped back, her unease growing. Then the knocking came again, this time from the window. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes drawn to the frost-covered glass. A face was pressed against it. A pale, distorted face with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched impossibly wide. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and Ness leaving behind only the impression of its breath on the glass. Casey grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Desperate, she decided to confront the innkeeper. The hallway was eerily silent as she made her way downstairs. The portraits seemed different now, their subjects' faces twisted into grimaces of fear. When she reached the lobby, the man was gone. The desk was empty, and the ledger had been replaced by a thick layer of dust. Panic set in as she realized the front door was locked, the heavy bolt impossible to budge. A whisper brushed against her ear, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." Casey spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room, creeping closer. She ran back to her room, slamming the door behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed her back against the wood. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and filling the room. "Join us. Stay forever. You can't leave." The door rattled violently as if something was trying to force its way in. Casey backed into the corner, clutching the lamp from the bedside table as her only weapon. The rattling stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the door burst open and the shadows flooded in, swallowing the light and everything else. By morning, the storm had cleared and the Pine Hollow Inn stood silent once more. Travelers on the old highway spoke of a strange feeling as they passed, an unnatural chill that lingered long after they'd gone. Casey's car was found buried in snow just outside the inn. Inside, her belongings remained untouched, but she was never seen again.
Story number 8.
The snow had fallen heavy that December night, muffling the world in a ghostly silence. Julian had always loved the serenity of winter, but something about tonight felt wrong. The town was eerily quiet, the streetlights flickering sporadically as he walked home from his late shift at the diner. He took the shortcut through Ravenwood Park, a path he'd traveled countless times. The towering evergreens, laden with snow, formed a dense canopy overhead. His breath fogged the air as his boots crunched through the frozen path. Halfway through the park, Julian stopped. A figure stood in the distance, motionless, under the pale glow of a flickering lamppost. It was hard to tell if it was a person or just a trick of the light. "Hello?" he called out, his voice carrying into the void. The figure didn't move. Julian's pulse quickened. He took a step forward, squinting to get a better look. That's when he saw it. The figure wasn't standing on the ground. It was hovering, its feet several inches above the snow. He froze, his mind racing for a rational explanation. Before he could think further, the lamppost blinked out, plunging the path into darkness. Julian fumbled for his phone, but his trembling hands made it difficult to turn on the flashlight. When he finally succeeded, the beam of light illuminated nothing. The figure was gone. He laughed nervously, trying to convince himself it had been a shadow or a trick of his tired mind. He picked up his pace, eager to get home, but the feeling of being watched clung to him like a second skin. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, certain he'd see something following him. He didn't, not until he reached the edge of the park. The figure was there again, just a few yards away, hovering above the ground. This time it was closer, and Julian could make out more details. Its face was pale, featureless, except for two deep, hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. Its body was shrouded in a tattered cloak that billowed unnaturally in the still air. Julian ran. The icy wind tore at his face as he sprinted through the empty streets, his boots slipping on patches of ice. He didn't dare look back, even as he heard the faint sound of whispering behind him. By the time he reached his apartment, his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He slammed the door shut, locking it and bolting every latch. Safe inside, he leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The whispers were gone, and for the first time in hours, he felt a glimmer of relief, until his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting a notification or a missed call. Instead, there was a photo, a picture of him standing in his apartment, taken from just outside his window. Julian's blood ran cold as he turned toward the window. The pale face was pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring straight at him. The lights flickered, and the whispers returned, louder now, echoing through his apartment. "You can't escape. We are here. Forever." The last thing Julian remembered was the glass shattering and the shadow pouring into the room like smoke. By morning, his apartment was untouched, the door still locked from the inside. The only sign of Julian was the single set of footprints leading into Ravenwood Park, ending abruptly in the middle of the snow-covered path.
Story number 9.
The small town of Cedar Hollow prided itself on its idyllic charm during the holidays. Every year, the residents would decorate their homes with twinkling lights, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. But there was one house on the outskirts of town that no one dared to approach during Christmas or any other time of year. The Blackwood house had been abandoned for decades, standing as a grim reminder of the family that vanished on Christmas Eve 30 years ago. Stories varied. Some claimed they were murdered, others believed they fled something unnatural. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one who entered the house came out the same. Despite the warnings, Aaron and his two friends, Kelly and Max, decided the old mansion would be the perfect spot for a thrilling Christmas dare. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey for courage, they made their way to the looming structure late at night, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The house was more imposing up close, its blackened windows staring back like hollow eyes. The front door creaked ominously as Aaron pushed it open, revealing an interior frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, a grand piano, and a long-forgotten Christmas tree stood eerily untouched, its ornaments dulled with age. "Creepy, but kind of cool," Max said, his voice wavering as their footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Kelly shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Let's just look around and leave. This place gives me the creeps." They explored the first floor, finding little more than cobwebs and peeling wallpaper. Then they ventured upstairs, where the air grew colder with every step. At the end of the hallway was a room with the door slightly ajar. From inside came the faint sound of music, a haunting rendition of Silent Night. Aaron exchanged a nervous glance with Kelly and Max before pushing the door open. Inside was a nursery, untouched by time. A rocking horse stood in one corner, and a crib sat beneath a window frosted with ice. On the floor was an antique music box, its lid open and spinning slowly, though none of them had touched it. "Okay, this is officially too much," Kelly whispered, backing toward the door. But Aaron's curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the room, kneeling beside the music box. The melody was distorted, as though played underwater. He reached out to close the lid when the rocking horse creaked, moving back and forth on its own. "What the hell?" Max muttered, pulling Kelly closer. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the music box stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the laughter, soft, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the room. Aaron turned toward the crib, his flashlight trembling in his hands. A figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light. It was a child, or at least it had the shape of one. Its face was pale and featureless, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. "Why did you come here?" The child's voice echoed, though its mouth didn't move. Kelly screamed, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, frost creeping up the walls as the laughter grew louder, joined by whispers. "You shouldn't be here. They won't let you leave. Stay with us." The figure stepped closer, its limbs jerking with unnatural movements. Aaron swung his flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to pass right through. Suddenly, the music box sprang to life, its melody shrill and chaotic. The whispers turned to screams, and the room began to shake. The door flew open, and the three of them bolted, racing down the stairs and out of the house. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town. The next morning, Aaron woke to find his hands covered in frostbite, though he didn't remember feeling the cold. Kelly refused to leave her house, muttering about the faces she'd seen in the walls. Max didn't speak at all, his eyes hollow and distant. Years later, the Blackwood house still stands, its windows dark and uninviting. Every Christmas, faint music can be heard drifting from its halls, accompanied by the sound of children's laughter. No one else has dared to enter, and the townspeople know better than to look too closely, because the house remembers those who visit, and it never lets them forget.
Story number 10.
The wind howled through the darkened streets as Emily navigated her car down the icy back roads, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She had been driving for hours, desperate to reach her grandmother's cabin before the blizzard fully hit. The radio crackled, the static broken by faint bursts of a Christmas carol, distorted and eerie. Her GPS had stopped working miles back, and the desolation of the road pressed in on her. Snow fell thick and heavy, blurring the line between road and wilderness. She was beginning to doubt she was even on the right path when her headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Emily slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a stop just feet from the figure. It was a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked as though it belonged to another century. He wore no coat, no gloves, and yet he stood motionless, unaffected by the biting wind. She rolled down her window a fraction, the icy air stinging her face. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He tilted his head, staring at her with eyes that seemed far too dark for the pale light. Something about him sent a chill deeper than the winter air. Emily hit the lock button on her car, her pulse racing. She looked back down the road, considering reversing and finding another way. When she looked back, the man was gone. Her breath hitched. She scanned the road, the woods, her rearview mirror. Nothing. The only movement was the swirling snow. She shook her head, trying to shake the unease. "Just tired," she whispered to herself. Pushing forward, she continued down the road, her headlights piercing through the whiteout. The wind seemed to grow louder, a low, mournful howl that sent shivers down her spine. Minutes later, her headlights illuminated something ahead. A house. Not her grandmother's cabin, but an old, two-story Victorian that loomed out of the snow like a forgotten relic. It wasn't on the map, but at least it was shelter. Her car sputtered as she slowed to a stop in front of the house. The gas gauge needle was perilously close to empty. Reluctantly, Emily grabbed her coat and flashlight, stepping out into the snow. She could barely feel her fingers by the time she reached the porch. The door creaked open as though expecting her, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. No answer. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of pine and something sour like spoiled cider. A grand staircase spiraled up into darkness, and tinsel hung limply from an ancient Christmas tree in the corner. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to leave, but the cold outside was unbearable. Just until the storm passes, she told herself. As she moved through the house, she noticed strange things. Photographs on the wall depicting families with faces scratched out, faint whispers that seemed to follow her, and the clock on the mantel frozen at 11:59. She entered the kitchen, hoping to find something to eat. The table was set for a feast, but the food was rotten, the turkey blackened and crawling with insects. Her stomach churned as she backed away, the whispers growing louder. A sudden crash upstairs made her jump. "Hello?" She called again, her voice cracking. No response. Against her better judgment, she climbed the staircase, each step groaning under her weight. At the top, a single hallway stretched before her, the doors all slightly ajar. She approached the first room and pushed the door open. It was a child's bedroom, untouched and eerily pristine. A rocking chair moved slowly in the corner, though there was no breeze. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. Emily's flashlight flickered, plunging her into near darkness. The whispers were no longer faint. They were all around her, overlapping voices that hissed and wailed. She turned back toward the rocking chair. A figure sat there now, a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow pits, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman rasped, her voice a chorus of agony. Emily screamed, throwing open the door and racing down the hall. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the floorboards cracking beneath her feet. She stumbled down the stairs, her heart pounding as the whispers turned into laughter. Cold, mocking laughter. When she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. She pulled and screamed, the cold air seeping through the cracks. Then she felt it, a hand on her shoulder. Emily spun around, her flashlight illuminating the man from the road. His dark eyes bored into hers, and his mouth moved, though no sound came out. The last thing she saw was his hand reaching toward her, impossibly long fingers curling around her throat. The next morning, a snowplow driver found Emily's car abandoned on the road. Her footprints led to where the Victorian house had stood, but there was no house, only an empty clearing, the snow untouched except for a single set of footprints that stopped abruptly in the center.